Mr. Buster Flips!
Mr. Buster Flips! Mr. Buster Flips! Mr. Buster Flips!
Welcome to this video on how to structure a comparative essay response. I'm using examples and ideas that are relevant to IB Paper 2, but there's no reason this couldn't work for any English course where you write comparative essays, which, to be honest, is most English courses as far as I know. So the first thing we want to think about is, what is the purpose of a comparative response? Well, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to illustrate similarities or differences between two texts in the case of English. And you're trying to convince your reader that your ideas are correct. And therefore, as in any essay, be assertive. Make sure that you convince your reader that your opinion is correct. In a comparative essay, there are a few things that you have to do. You have to show engagement with both sides of the argument. Even though you might be favoring one side, you should definitely be engaging with both sides. Or in the case of two texts, you've got to be balanced. Make sure that you cover both texts really well. And you need to compare and contrast. You can't just say, yeah, these two poets are exactly the same. They use the same things with the same effect, and it's all the same. Excuse me. That will make a very bland essay. You want to be quite balanced in terms of where they agree and where they disagree as well. And it is important that you use language to signpost that you are doing a comparative response here, so that your language has phrases like in contrast, likewise, similarly, to show that you are comparing the two texts. So let's first look at the issue of balance. You've got to make sure that you give both of your two texts the same amount of or an equal treatment in your essay. So you're not writing 3/4 of the essay about one poet or poem and then write just 1/4 on the second. Make sure that you've got roughly equal balance. And then obviously make sure that you find specific passages, close references, maybe quotations that directly link between the two poems so that you can compare the text well in that sense. So you're not comparing apples and oranges too much. When it comes to structure, in essence, there are, in my opinion, three types of structures that you can use. There's a block structure. We deal with issues separately. There's a kind of a similarities to differences structure, or differences to similarities if you prefer. And lastly, you can do work both texts together and go from issue to issue. You'll find that these are very rough descriptions, and probably as your essay writing improves, you'll be able to create hybrids that use all three of these structures interchangeably. So let's look at an example of the block structure first. Excuse me. So when you're doing a block structure, you would start with the first issue in the first text and examine that closely, and then you would look at the same issue in your second text in your next paragraph. And then you'd go on to a second issue in text 1 in your third paragraph, and then your last paragraph would deal with the second issue in the second text. These are not, ignore these numbers completely, they're not quantifying anything specifically in terms of you need to deal with two issues or two texts. I'm just giving you examples of how to structure this response. You might have 5 issues in 2 or 3 texts, though probably not for an IB paper 2. So here's an example of what the topic sentences might look like if you are writing a block structure response. I'm using John Donne and Seamus Heaney, the two poets, as examples here, but obviously you could insert any text of your choice. So the first paragraph would explore how John Donne is able to achieve conciseness in his poems by relying heavily on conceits. In his poem, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, he uses 3 central conceits to achieve this conciseness. And then you would insert 3 evidence clusters where you prove this point that you just made in your topic sentence. And then your second paragraph would have, in contrast to Donne, Seamus Heaney achieves brevity in his poems. So obviously, sorry, I should have mentioned that at the start. This whole, my examples here are all based on an essay question that somehow is asking about why is poetry brief, or how do poets achieve brevity in poetry. So all my examples are about how poetry is quite brief. In contrast to Donne, Seamus Heaney achieves brevity in his poems by relying on familiar rural environs that do not require substantial description to assist the reader. The opening section of his poem, Seeing Things, focuses on a select few items to set the scene on a Sunday journey to church. And then again, you'd give 3 or 4 evidence clusters to illustrate the point of how he describes his environment. Another way that Donne manages to be succinct, this is my third paragraph, in the expression of his poetic ideas, is through ambiguous allusions, both to pious longing and to carnal lust. And then you would give some examples of that and how Donne is ambiguous in his expression. Contrastingly, Heaney tends to be highly detailed in his description of human lust when, for instance, in Blackberry Picking, the lust and desire for gluttony becomes sinful. And then you'd find 3 to 4 examples and create evidence classes where you show how that's the case in Blackberry Picking. So with the addition, obviously, of that evidence plus an introduction and a conclusion, that would constitute my block structure essay on brevity. So the second model we're going to look at is an essay that's structured on from similarities to differences, or vice versa. So for instance, start with one issue that both texts share and discuss that with evidence, and then have a second issue with both texts share as well, and then move on to one where they differ, and then your fourth paragraph will deal with the second issue where the text differs. So for instance, if I was to write a paragraph again on brevity and how poetry is concise, then we could look at topic sentences like these. Both Heaney and Donne rely on visual imagery to engage the reader and ensure conciseness in their poetry. And then you would have 4 to 5 evidence clusters to exemplify how and why they use visual imagery. Similarly, both poets use metaphor extensively in their poetic craft to create a vivid sensory experience for their readers through a minimal number of words. And then again, you would have 4 to 5 bits of evidence to demonstrate how they use metaphorical imageries heavily. And your third paragraph might be, while Donne's conceits are often outrageous and surprising to the reader, Heaney's use more traditional symbols to connect his readers with his subject matter. So here you can see how we're highlighting a difference in how the poets operate. And then you'd have 4 or 5 evidence clusters showing how the different types of symbols operate. And then your last paragraph might be, another area in which these two poets differ is their reliance on oral imagery to contribute to the impact of the poem. And then you'd have 4 to 5 evidence clusters again that illustrate how the use of sounds is different in the two poets' work. So again, that would in essence be the body of your essay. Same thing, so we've gone from 2 paragraphs with similar items to 2 where the two poets use different techniques. The third structure we talked about is issue by issue. And you can see possibly as well how there's a kind of progression in these 3 structures from simple to more complex. You could say that the block structure is probably the easiest one to write. The similarities to differences is a bit more difficult, and issue by issue, you really should be weaving between the 2 texts, and you can make this essay quite sophisticated and show how strong a writer you are. Remember, this is your chance to show, after 11, 12 years of school, how much your writing has developed and how you've grown as a writer. So in an issue by issue, you would have the first issue and deal with it through both texts, and then you would have your second issue in your second paragraph and deal with that in both texts as well. And it might be a case of having 3 examples from one text and 2 from the other in your first paragraph, and then you reverse that and have 3 from the second text in the second paragraph and 2 from the other, so that you get a balance between the 2 texts, but not necessarily complete balance within the paragraphs. So here are my examples of topic sentences for an issue by issue structured essay. Even though both poets use symbols to contribute to the brevity of their poems, I'm sorry for the spelling of their, just making sure you're paying attention, the types of symbols used vary greatly. And then again, you would insert 4 to 5 examples on how they use symbolism, but how it varies, there's a disparity in how they use them. Likewise, my second topic sentence, there is significant disparity in how reliant the two poets are on poetic form. And then you'd have 4 or 5 examples, 4 or 5 evidence clusters illustrating how their use of traditional poetic form varies and why that is. Third paragraph, in regards to reliance on development of setting, the two poets are quite similar. And then you can have 4 or 5 examples on how they describe their settings. So you don't need to illustrate differences as long as you're discussing both texts issue by issue. Yet another technique utilized by both poets to ensure brevity, conciseness in their poems is reliance on allusion and connotation. And then you'd insert 4 to 5 examples through evidence clusters showing the different ways the two poets use these techniques. I want to conclude this video by just giving you a few pointers on how to plan your essay response. So you've got an idea of the 3 types of structures you might utilize. So now I want to give you some ideas about how to gather the material for your essay and how to get the body full of valuable information. So one useful tool when you're doing comparative essays is to organize your ideas visually. And I think a Venn diagram is an excellent tool for that, because you can easily see how the two texts in this case are different and what elements they share. You might have the overlapping intersecting part of the Venn diagram a bit bigger, but in essence that's a good tool for planning. So once you've brainstormed your ideas, then you need to select what's relevant. So highlight the most fascinating, fruitful ideas that you can really expand into useful paragraphs. And then once you've done that, you've sorted out what's going to go in the paragraphs, you can then start writing a thesis for your essay. Make sure it's something that's going to grab your reader and make sure that they stick with you to the end. And it's something that you can be assertive about and something you can sustain and prove in your essay. And then organize your supporting details in that. And when it comes to the evidence clusters, remember to use a where, what, how, and why structure in those evidence clusters. I'll illustrate that for you in case you're not familiar with what I'm talking about. So I would build each evidence cluster by answering those 4 questions. So where is my piece of evidence coming from? Well, in the opening stanza of, and then whichever poem you're talking about. What's the point you're going to make? Well, Heaney conveys the innocence of a child. And how does he do this? So here's your technical analysis, bring in your literary device. This allows him to create an effective contrast in the following stanza when, blah, blah, blah. And lastly, what is the effect? Why is he doing this? What's the effect on the reader? Well, using contrast in this way highlights to the reader, blah, blah, blah. So that's how you would structure each of your bits of evidence cluster. So you've got your topic sentence, and then you have 3 to 4 of these, or 4 to 5 of these in a paragraph. That way, your essay is very clearly put together. Returning now to something I said at the beginning of this video, I told you to remember to use vocabulary that signals comparison and links ideas. Here are some ideas of phrases that you might use to do that to your reader. Make sure that they are seeing that you are comparing the 2 texts. You can think of other terms like these, but these are some examples of comparative language. If you think of other ways that I can help you in your studies, please let me know, post a comment below or send me a message, and I will do my best to assist you in the preparation for your examinations. Good luck.